By Silvermoon, where are they? Alleria raced through the forest, sword in hand, the leaves and branches whipping past her as a blur. The other rangers had fanned out to cover more ground, and Alleria hoped they hadn't run into any orcs or trolls. She wanted those miserable green-skinned intruders for herself. Not for the first time since seeing the fire, she'd wished she'd never left home. Why had she decided that the Alliance needed her help? Weren't Anasterian Sunstrider and the other council members far older and wiser than she was, and thus far better equipped to decide what aid they should offer the younger races? Then again, Anasterian had been convinced that the Horde would never pose a threat to them here in Kel'Thalas. That was why he felt the Alliance was not their concern, because they were safe from whatever was occurring in the outside world. Clearly, he had been wrong. Still, if Alleria had listened to him and abided by his decision, she would not have been here, not sailing downriver or marching over hills. She would have been here when the orcs and trolls arrived, here with her family and her people when the Horde breached their borders. Would it have made any difference? She did not know. Perhaps not. What could one more ranger have done to stop an enemy she wouldn't even realize was approaching? But at least she wouldn't now feel like she had deserted them in their hour of need. The thought spurred her to even greater speed, and she leaped over a low bush into a tiny clearing between two clusters of trees, and found herself staring down the tip of a hunting arrow aimed at her throat. The figure holding the bow was nearly as tall as her, and wearing similar garb, though far less travel-stained. Long hair streamed back from beneath the cloak's hood and seemed to gleam like ivory in the sunlight, a shining silvery white that Alleria knew too well to ever mistake it. Verisa? The other figure lowered the bow, her blue eyes wide with surprise and relief. Alleria? Then the bow had been tossed aside, and Alleria's younger sister had caught her up in a rough embrace. "You're home." Of course, Alleria squeezed Verisa in return and patted her head, a gesture so familiar it was automatic. "Are you all right?" she asked after a minute. "Where's Sylvanas? Are mother and father safe?" "They're fine," Verisa answered, disengaging and bending to retrieve her weapons. "Sylvanas is with a hunting party near the riverbank. As for mother and father, they should be in Silvermoon by now. They went to consult with the elders." She paused, fitting the arrow back to her string. "Alleria, where have you been, and what's going on? There are fires all over Kel'Thalas, and some of the other rangers, they haven't reported back." Alleria felt her stomach twist at the news. If rangers were going missing, it meant the Horde had penetrated deep into the forest already. "We're being invaded, little sister," she told Verisa bluntly, bringing her sword up and turning to put her back against her sister. Her ears twitched. "Now quiet." Quiet? But why? Verisa's comments were cut off as a tall figure dropped from the trees above. It lunged forward, a short-hafted, long-bladed axe in one hand, but Alleria had heard it just before its descent and was ready for it. She brought her sword up, parrying the blow, and spun to the side, neatly sidestepping its secondary attack with a long, curving dagger. Her sword arced about and removed the creature's head, and it pitched forward, the weapons falling from its now lifeless figure. "Quick," Alleria warned, stooping quickly and then straightening again. "We need to move, now." Verisa, wide-eyed at the sudden bloodshed, nodded and turned away, running as much from the violence as from her sister's order. She was still young, the youngest of the three sisters, and had never seen real combat before. Alleria had hoped it would be a long time before that would happen, but it was too late to worry about that now. They ran through the woods, and Alleria was sure she heard laughter above them somewhere. Trolls. The creatures were following them, keeping pace on the branches above. No doubt they planned to drop down on her and Verisa and kill both of them before they could find help. But the trolls didn't know this wood. Alleria did. She ran, leading Verisa and their unseen pursuers, twisting and turning and leaping, crossing streams and clearings, darting through groves, ducking under trees and vines. Verisa kept pace, her bow still in her hands, and the laughter clung to them as well. Then Alleria saw a ribbon of silver ahead. The river. She put on a spurt of additional speed, Verisa matching her, and they burst from the trees onto the strip of open land beside the river. She felt the impact behind her as one of the several trolls dropped from the trees, knowing they would have to catch her before she could wade into the deep water and float or swim beyond their reach. Trolls did not like water. "Nice chase, Pale One of the creatures behind her growled, "but now you die." Hands reached for her. Long claws scraped at her, catching at her hair. But Alleria twisted away, avoiding their grasp. She spun around, sword coming up and ready to fight as long as she could, and watched as the trolls stiffened and toppled backwards. A long shaft protruded from its neck. Similar shafts struck the other trolls, felling them before they could retreat to the safety of the trees. And Alleria, turning back toward the river, glanced around and saw several rangers on the far bank, their bows still quivering from the recent archery. One of them wore a long green cloak and a more ornate tunic than the others. She had long blonde hair, darker than Alleria's, but otherwise similar, and eyes more gray than green or blue, the same shape as both hers and Verisa's. The other rangers positioned themselves around her, and she smiled and held up her bow in salute. "Welcome home, Alleria," Sylvanas called. "Now what is this trouble you have brought us?" Even from the river, she radiated intensity, as if she could will the answers to appear. Alleria smiled at her sister's greetings. Sylvanas, Ranger General of all Cael'Thalas, was as forceful as ever, then shook her head. "I did not bring it, Sylvanas," she answered truthfully. "I had hoped to outrun it. But I do bring possible salvation." She glanced back at the dead trolls behind her and at Verisa, who stood swaying and pale and resolutely facing away from the recent corpses. "I must speak to the council." "I do not know if they will listen," Sylvanas warned. "They are too busy worrying about the fires to consider much else right now, as am I. They are appearing all across the forest, seemingly at random." She glanced pointedly at the dead trolls. "And now I must tend to this matter as well." Alleria grimaced and looked down. "They will listen," she promised. "I will give them no choice." "What is the meaning of this?" Anasterian Sunrider demanded. New scene also. He and the Council of Silvermoon were discussing matters in low, serious voices when Alleria walked in unannounced and uninvited. Several of the high elf rulers rose from their seats, surprised at her presence, but Alleria ignored them. She focused only on Anasterian. The high elf king was old even for an elf, with hair that had long since turned white, and skin thin as parchment, and lined as a piece of old wood. He had gone from slender to frail, but his blue eyes were still piercing, and his voice, though thin as well, was still filled with authority. Alleria instinctively shrank back from his anger, but then she remembered why she was here and straightened. "I am Alleria Windrunner," she announced, though she knew most of the council members recognized her. "I've been beyond our borders, and have fought alongside the humans in their war, and I have returned to bring you grave tidings, not just for them, but for us." She frowned and studied the men and women before her. The horde the humans warned is real, and vast and powerful. The bulk of their forces are orcs, but they have other creatures as well, including the forest trolls. That got a reaction. Gasps and angry mutterings. None of the other high elves knew what an orc was, She hadn't herself until she'd fought them in Hillsbrad, but they all knew about trolls. Some here, including Anasterian himself, had even fought in the Great Troll Wars long ago, some 4,000 years after aLilFoxz was founded. You say this horde includes trolls, a lord stated loudly. Yet why should that concern us? Let the trolls follow these strange creatures you tell of, and hopefully march far away from here. Perhaps the humans will even do us a favor and kill them for us. Several other elves laughed and nodded. You do not understand, Alleria told them angrily. The horde is not some distant problem we can ignore and laugh about. They intend to conquer all of Lordaeron, from coast to coast, and that includes us here in aLilFoxz. Let them come, another lord, an elven mage she thought was named Dar Khan, scoffed. Our lands are well defended. None can pass the runestones and survive. Oh no, Alleria snarled at them. Are you so sure? Because already the trolls have entered our forests. Already they stalk through our lands, killing our people, and the orcs will not be far behind. They are less powerful than trolls, individually, but they are as numerous as locusts, enough of them to cover the land, and they are here. Here, Anasterian scoffed, impossible. In answer, Alleria swung her arm and released the object she had been carrying since she and Verisa had run. The troll's head flew through the air, its short dark hair waving about it, the sun catching on a tusk, and fell again, landing just before Anasterian's feet. This one attacked Verisa and me, Alleria explained, not an hour's run from river crossing. Several more followed us to there, and their bodies still lie on the far bank unless Sylvanas and her party have moved them. She noticed that none of the lords were laughing anymore. They are here, she insisted again. The trolls are within our woods killing our people, and the orcs are the ones burning the edges of Eversong Forest. Though she admitted to herself she did not know how they could be causing the other fires both Verisa and Sylvanas had mentioned. Outrageous. This time Anasterian's outburst was not directed at her. The Elf King kicked the troll head, causing it to roll away under another lord's chair. His eyes were sharp and his brow drawn, and when he turned back to Alleria, she could see the energy and focus that had made him such a great king for so many years. All hints of frailty were gone, brushed aside in the current crisis. They dare invade our home? Anasterian fumed. They dare. He looked up and his expression was like thunder. We shall teach them to trespass here. Gather our warriors, he instructed the other lords. Summon our rangers. We will attack the trolls and drive them from our forest so sternly that they shall never dare encroach again. Alleria was pleased to see her king so determined, and certainly agreed with the sentiment, but she shook her head anyway. The trolls are only part of the danger, she reminded Anasterian and the others. The horde is numerous beyond belief, and the orcs are strong, tough, and determined. She grinned. Fortunately, I did not come alone. Turalyon was battling a pair of orcs, and had just smashed one into the ground with his hammer, though he took a heavy blow on his shield from the other. A third orc leaped at him, almost knocking him from his horse, and since the creature was too close to strike with a weapon, Turalyon headbutted him instead, his heavy helm striking the orc across the brow and bridge of the nose and leaving him stunned. Turalyon shoved the dazed orc off his horse and onto a third foe, then used that opportunity to strike both of them good hard blows. Neither of them would get up again. He brushed water from the front of his helmet, taking a second to peer up at the thick gray clouds that hung above them. The rain showed no sign of letting up, though he supposed that was a good thing. At least the fires were out now, and unlikely to start again. He supposed he could stand fighting in such soggy, miserable weather if it helped keep the elven homeland from burning to the ground. Off to his side he caught a brief glimpse of Khadgar, who was laying about him with sword and staff. The wizard had exhausted his magic summoning the vast storm, which stretched across the entire front of aLilFoxz. but he was proving formidable enough with mundane weapons that Turalyon knew he should not waste time worrying about his friend. Besides, he had enough foes that he should be focusing that worry on himself instead. Turalyon was just turning to deal with a pair of orcs at his left flank when one of the two stiffened, twitched, and toppled over, an arrow through his throat. Turalyon recognized the fletching and grinned. Sure enough, a lithe woman darted toward him a moment later. Somehow the rain was ignoring her, falling around her instead of on her, and Turalyon was not sure if it was elven magic or just the sheer power of her natural beauty. "I can see I got here just in time," Alleria commented as she reached him, idly turning, putting an arrow in another orc's throat. "What do you do when I'm not around to save you?" "I managed," Turalyon replied, too caught up in battle to feel flustered by her presence. He blocked an attack and struck down the orc in question, already turning to find the next foe. "Did you find them?" "I did," she confirmed, "and they have agreed. Already the warriors and rangers are mobilized. They can be here in 10 minutes if here is where you want them." Turalyon nodded, using his hammer's long shaft to block an axe swing, and then shortening his grip so the hammer's head struck the offending orc on the return swing. "Here is as good a place as any," he answered, "and as long as we are here to fight them, the horde isn't going anywhere." Alleria nodded. "I will run back and inform them. You have only to hold fast until they arrive." Her voice sounded strange, and Turalyon risked a quick glance. By the light, was she crying? She certainly looked sad. No doubt the invasion of her homeland had taken a hard toll upon her. "We will hold," he assured her grimly. "We must." And Alleria was gone again. Turalyon only hoped she and her kin returned before the rest of the horde overwhelmed their tiny defense. Already, waves of orcs were pouring in from the sides, and Turalyon knew his forces could not stand against the entire orc army. Especially not here, on an open field where the orcs could surround them and swarm them under. They would need support, and quickly. He just hoped the elves were as ready and as capable as Alleria had made them sound. Turlij, one of Zul'jin's subordinates, grinned. He and his pack had smelled something unpleasant nearby, and had followed their noses to a delicious sound, a single, soft thump-thump on the forest floor below, a lone elf. Turlij had been charged with watching this path, which led toward the elven city, and keeping any elves from crossing it. Well, this was one elf who would go no farther. Lowering himself slightly foliage, Turlij caught sight of his prey. The elf was moving quickly enough for one of its kind, and most likely other creatures would have thought it quiet. But to Turlij, its passage was as loud as the thunder he heard rumbling near the forest edge, and its pace was easily surpassed. The elf wore a long brown cloak, the hood raised, and was leaning upon a long staff. An elder then, even better. Licking his lips with anticipation, Turlij motioned his pack to follow him down. Then he dropped from the trees, his curved blade in hand, and grinned at his victim, and started in surprise as the elf tossed back his cloak and straightened with a grin of his own. The staff swung up and around, revealing a long blade at one end, and armor gleamed even in the shadows of the trees. "Did you think we could not hear you rustling above us?" the elf sneered, his narrow features pulled taut in a glower. "Did you think we could not sense you befouling our forest? You are not welcome here, creature, and you will not be suffered to live." Turlij recovered from his surprise and laughed. "Very clever, little pale one," he agreed. "A fine trick you be playing on, Turlij. But there is only one of you, with your little stick, and many of us." The rest of his pack landed behind him and ranged out, ready to surround the arrogant elf. But the elf only grinned more widely, his expression nasty. "Do you think so, oaf?" he taunted. "You pride yourself in your woodcraft, yet you are blind in the forest compared to us, and deaf." Suddenly a second elf emerged from behind a nearby tree, and then a third, and a fourth. Turlage frowned. There was more and more of them, until he and his pack were surrounded and thoroughly outnumbered. And all of them carried the same long spears and bore tall oblong shields. This was not what he had expected. Nonetheless, Turlage was a seasoned hunter and a warrior, and was not so easily frightened. "Better," he announced finally, raising to his full height. "A real fight, not just picking off an unarmed elf. I like it." And he leaped upon the lead elf, his sword raised high, and died in midair, the elf commander's spear sliding through his chest and piercing his heart before emerging on his back. The elf stepped to one side, letting Turlage's body slide from his weapon, and pivoted, sweeping the spear around in a deadly arc to slice off the hand of a troll advancing on him. The battle was over quickly. The elf leader kicked at one of the bodies, which did not move, and nodded. He had faced forest trolls before, though never here in Kel'Thalas, and while they were talented forest hunters compared to most races, they were clumsy when matched against an elf. Sylvanas had sent his patrol out, one of many, with orders to flush out and kill any trolls they could find. This was the second pack he had encountered, and he wondered how many more still crashed through the forest. He was opening his mouth to rally his men when a slender figure burst into the clearing, golden hair strewn behind her. His ears had picked up her approach seconds before she arrived, and clearly she had placed speed over customary stealth. "Halderon," she called as she approached, slowing to a stop a few feet from him. "Good. I've spoken with the Allegiance commander and with Sylvanas as well. She needs all our forces along the southwest edge of the forest. That is where the Horde has gathered, and he cannot hold them for long." Halderon Brightwing nodded. "I shall inform Lord Thamar, for his band is near her as well," he assured her. "And we will come to the aid of your friends. Their fight is now ours, and we will not allow them to fall before these foul creatures." He paused, studying her for a second. "Are you well, Alleria? You seem flushed." Alleria shook her head, though a faint frown flitted across her face. "I'm fine," she assured him. "Now go, bring our warriors. I will return to my sister and to the Alliance and reassure them that aid is on the way." And she was gone again, turning on her heel and dashing back into the trees. Halderon watched her go, then shook himself. He had known Alleria Windrunner a long time and could see that something had bothered or unsettled her. But they were all bothered this day, when strange creatures roamed their sacred woods. Not for long, however. Gesturing to his rangers, Halderon pulled his spear free of a troll and wiped it clean on the body, then turned. There would be time to rid the forest of their filth later. First, they must deal with the foes still living. Turallion felt it had been only minutes since Alleria's departure when she appeared again, surfacing through the battle to stand beside him. Her bow was slung across her back now, and she had her sword in hand instead, using it to cut down an orc that had been trying to stab his horse in the hindquarters. "They will be here," she assured him, her eyes bright, and Turallion nodded. He felt a surge of relief, though whether at the thought of reinforcements or the fact that she was still safe, he was not sure. He frowned, unused to such thoughts, and pushed them aside for now. First, he needed to worry about his troops and troop survival. The rain had finally stopped, though the clouds remained, casting the battlefield into shadow. So when Turallion saw a dark shape loom up off to one side, at first he thought it was simply a distorted shadow from one orc warrior. But the shape continued to grow and to gain solidity, and he stared, almost getting skewered by an orc as a result. "Stay focused," Khadgar warned, riding up beside him and kicking the orc away before it could strike again. "What are you staring at?" "That." Trollian replied, pointing with his hammer before returning his attention to the fight raging around him. Now it was Khadgar's turn to stare, and the young old wizard let out a string of curses as he saw the massive figure that had emerged from the trees and joined the far edge of the battle. It was easily twice the size of even an orc, with skin the color of aged leather. It held a massive hammer, most likely an orc two-handed weapon, but used in a single hand by the behemoth, and wore strange armor. Trollian's jaw tightened as he risked a second glance and realized the armor was human. Breastplates and greaves and bracers linked together by thick chains to cover most of the massive creature's flesh. Its twin heads were bare, however, and glared down at the men and orcs milling before it. The hammer swept down as well, crushing 2 men in a single blow, and then swept to one side, knocking 4 more soldiers from their feet and tossing them several yards away. "What the hell is that thing?" Trollian demanded, smashing a charging orc in the face and driving it back against another who staggered under the shared impact. "An ogre," Khadgar replied, "a 2-headed one." Trollian started to tell his friends that yes, he had seen ogres before, and he had realized this one had 2 heads, when the strange ogre raised its empty hand toward a cluster of lion soldiers. Trollian blinked, thinking his eyes were playing tricks upon him. Had he just seen fire pour from the creature's outstretched hand toward the soldiers? He looked again. Yes, there were flames licking about the soldiers now, and the men were dropping their weapons to beat at themselves where the fires danced across their armor and clothing. Several were pulling off their cloaks, which had ignited, and others were rolling in the grass, trying to put out the flames that tormented them. How had the strange new ogre done that? Damn, Khadgar had clearly seen it as well. If his increased cursing was any indication, he's an ogre mage. A what? A wizard, Khadgar snapped. A bloody ogre wizard. Ah. Trollian dispatched another foe and stared at the monstrous ogre again, trying to understand this. The largest, strongest creature he had ever seen, and it cast magic. Wonderful. What would it take to kill such a beast? He started to ask Khadgar this, and choked on his words as the ogre mage suddenly reeled and fell forward. The hair on the back of his head spiked straight up by the last of the rainfall. At first, Trollian thought it was leaning down to do something to the bodies before it, perhaps devour them with its twin mouths, but the creature did not get up again. And then he realized that what he had taken for hair was too solid for that. Those were shafts, too big to be arrows, spears. "Yes," Alleria cheered, raising her bow high in salute. "My people have arrived." And she was right, Trollian saw, for the forest emerged row upon row of elves. These wore more armor than Alleria and her rangers, and heavier gear, and carried shields and spears as well. Clearly, it had been their weapons that had felled the ogre mage. Trollian had never been so happy to see anyone in his life. "They have excellent timing," he told Alleria, having to shout to make himself heard over the utter chaos of combat. "Can you relay messages at all?" She nodded. "We use gestures for hunting, and they can be read at a distance." "Good." Trollian nodded and pounded another orc into the ground as he marshaled his thoughts. "We need to crush the horde between us. Tell them to advance toward us, but also to spread out along the edges and sweep in. We'll do the same. I don't want the orcs to just squeeze out the sides, because then they could close in on us instead." Alleria nodded and began gesturing toward the forest, and Trollian saw one of the elves in the front nod and turn to his fellows. One of them pushed another one over and it was just laying on its back, screaming all by itself. Khadgar had been close enough to hear the discussion. He was already turning toward a nearby unit leader, shouting orders and telling the man to pass along as well. Both armies began to fan out, the Alliance forces retreating slightly so they would have room to move. The Horde clearly took this as a sign of defeat, because a cheer went up among the orcs. Most of them had not yet seen the elves, who were still partially hidden beneath the trees. That was fine. Trollian wanted them taken by surprise as much as possible, to reduce the chance of their getting away. He pulled his men back, detailing several units to hold the orcs at bay, while the others got some distance between them, and then sent a third of his troops to each side and told them to sweep back in from there. The rest he kept with him, and he could see the Horde's puzzlement as he turned and led the charge straight back into their midst. On the far side, the elves had arrayed themselves in a similar fashion, and as the Horde braced itself to meet Trollian's attack, the elves stepped forward, sweeping down with their spears to slice into the rearmost row of orcs. Many fell without a sound, but enough gasped or sighed or groaned that others turned to see what had disturbed their comrades. And then a ragged shout went up as the orcs realized they were beset on both sides. Several orc warriors turned and tried to run, realizing they were now trapped between two armies. But the arms of both human and elven forces curled around, blocking any escape. The orcs were forced to stand and fight, and most did so happily, losing themselves in rage and bloodlust. But with enemies on all sides and elven bows and spears to complement human sword and axe and hammers, the orcs began to take heavy casualties. Trollian felt a surge of hope. They were winning. The Horde still outnumbered its own soldiers and the elven warriors, but they were trapped and undisciplined. Each orc was fighting for himself, or with a handful of others, most likely members of the same clan, and that left them vulnerable to the humans and elven tactics, particularly as his own men and the elves began working together more smoothly, the elven archers firing into a cluster of orcs to thin their ranks and cause confusion before the humans waded in, with the elven spearmen right behind them to stab and block and keep the orcs from ganging up on any soldiers. Already he could see visible gaps in the Horde, and as the Alliance and elves moved in, those gaps expanded, leaving only pockets of the orcs behind. Then he heard a loud roar. Glancing to the east, Trollian saw a sight that made his stomach clench. Another of those monstrous two-headed ogres was striding into the battle, laying about with a massive club that he realized was simply a tree trunk with the branches shorn clean. A second of the brutes was right behind the first, a similar club in its gargantuan hands, and then a third and a fourth followed him. Where were all these creatures coming from? The two-headed ogres waded into the Alliance troops, sweeping away whole units at a time. Trollian quickly ordered his men to fall back and let the elves handle this new menace. But the first ogre had been taken by surprise. These were better prepared. They used their clubs to knock aside the flights of arrows and volleys of spears, and then crashed into the elves, sending the slender warriors flying. The Horde began to reform around these massive figures, and more orcs poured in behind them, filling their ranks back out and quickly shifting the numbers back in their favor. We have to do something fast, Trollian shouted to Khadgar, who was beside him again. Otherwise, they'll sweep us back toward the mountains, or west toward the water, and we'll be the ones trapped. It was moving too fast to evade, especially with orc warriors everywhere, hampering the giant's progress. As he dropped, Kurdran raised his stormhammer, muscles tensing in anticipation. The beast roared again and swung at him with his massive club, but Skyreed dodged the blow and flew so close her wingtip brushed one of the creature's faces. Then Kurdran threw, putting all his considerable strength into the toss. The skies echoed with thunder, and a lightning bolt struck the creature just as he did, lending its strength to the impact. The creature reeled back. Its one head caved in, the other blackened, and it toppled. It crushed 3 orcs when it fell, and its club smashed into several more. Yes, Kurdran whooped, catching his hammer as it returned, and nudging Skyri up for another diving charge. That's showed him, my beauty. It don't matter how big they are, the wild hammers can bring 'em low. He raised his hammer high and let out a loud whoop as he rode into the sky, his griffin easily slipping past another brute's clumsy overhand swipe. What are you lot waiting for? He bellowed at his warriors, who grinned from their own circling mounts. I've shown you how it's done. Now get down there and make sure the rest of these giants come crashing down as well. They saluted mockingly, knowing his taunts were good-natured, and wheeled their griffins around to begin their own attacks. Kudrin grinned. He glanced down and spotted the mage, the elf, and the commander he had met back in Airy Peak. Ho down there, he bellowed, raising his hammer and twirling it above him. The elf raised her bow in salute, and the commander and the mage both nodded greetings. Your Lord Lothar sent us, Kurdran shouted, not sure they could hear from the altitude. And just in time, looks like. Then he brought his hammer back down, gripping it with both hands once again, and steered Skyri back down toward the next of the mammoth 2-headed creatures. Several had fallen already, and the horde was scattering around them, realizing their protectors were actually now a danger to them, and the humans and elves were using the chaos to slaughter the panicked orcs left and right. Then something shifted in the wind, and Kurdran glanced up. Above him to the south, he saw a dark shape gliding down. At first he thought it might be one of his warriors, come to relay news or orders, but then realized it did not fly right for a griffin. And it seemed to be coming from more to the east, past the hinterlands and possibly below them. But what? Breaking off his attack, Kurdran brought Skyri back up beyond the brute's reach and circled slowly, watching the approaching shadow. Was it a bird? If so, it was higher than most, and its outline was strange. Some new form of attack. He laughed. It was no bigger than an eagle. Were the horde sending eagles after them now, perhaps with gnomes perched upon their backs? As if any raptor could stand against his beauty, he thought, patting Skyri's neck affectionately and receiving a musical caw in return. But the shape was getting closer now, and growing larger, and larger, and larger still. By the Airy, Kurdran muttered, awed by its size. What was this thing that could stay aloft and be so large? It was already as big as his Skyri, and he had a suspicion it was still high above him. Now he could make out its shape more clearly, long and lean, with a long tail and neck and great wings that spread above it, and flapping only occasionally. This thing was gliding. It had to be high indeed to be coasting on the winds that way, and Kurdran felt a chill as he re-estimated its size again. He only knew of one airborne creature that large, and he couldn't imagine what one of them would want with this conflict. But then the last of the clouds faded away, and the sun shone down upon them, and gleamed red all along the creature, turning it into a soaring crimson streak, and Kurdran knew he had been right. It was a dragon. Dragon, he shouted. Most of his warriors were still battling the 2-headed brutes, but young Murkad glanced up and looked where Kurdran was pointing. Then the fool actually kicked his griffin into a rapid ascent, the mount flaring her wings out to gain altitude. What are you doing, you half-wit? Kurdran shouted, but if Murkad heard, he gave no reply. Instead, the youthful Wildhammer turned his mount toward the dragon, which was now angled in a steep dive, and raised his Stormhammer high. Giving a fierce yell, Murkad charged straight for the plummeting lizard, and vanished without a sound as the dragon opened its mouth, revealing great triangular teeth the size of a large dwarf, and a long forked tongue the color of blood, and consumed the hapless dwarf on his griffin in a single snap. Murkad had never even saw the sorrow evident in the dragon's enormous golden eyes, or the burly-skinned green figure perched on the dragon's back, long leather reins wrapped around one hand. By the light, Trollian had cheered with the others when the wild hammers had arrived, and when Curdran felled the first two-headed ogre. But he had glanced up again at a faint cry from the wild hammer leader, and had looked in time to see the fiery dragon descend upon the griffin rider and swallow him like he was a sausage. And now the dragon was descending upon them, and more were right behind it, streaks of crimson dropping by. The red dragons were not just the color of flame. Smoke curled from their nostrils, and sparks shot from their mouths as they breathed, brighter even than the sunlight gleaming off their claws and along their wings and tails. The smoke and sparks increased as Trollian stared. "Pull back," he shouted, slapping Khadgar's arm with his shield to get the mage's attention. "Have everyone pull back." He waved his hammer overhead, hoping that would get both his own people and the elves' attention. "Pull back, everyone, away from the forest now." "Away from the forest?" Alleria asked, sharply glancing up at him. He hadn't even realized she was still beside him, which showed how stunned he had been. "Why, we're winning." Trollian started to explain, then realized there probably wasn't time. "Just do it," he shouted, seeing the surprise in her face. "Tell your people to fall back toward the hills. Hurry." Something in his voice or expression convinced her, and she nodded, raising her bow and trying to signal the other elven warriors. Trollian left her to it and turned away, grabbing the first Alliance officer he found and relaying his orders again. The officer nodded and started shouting and shoving, turning his troops around while bellowing for other officers to do the same. There was nothing else Trollian could do. He wheeled his own horse around and kicked it into a gallop, racing for the hills. Then he heard a strange sound, like a sudden burst of wind or a loud exhalation from a big man, and glanced over his shoulder. The first dragon had swooped down, wings outspread, and opened its mouth wide. And from that mouth poured flames, great waves of flame that spread across the forest front edge. The heat was intense, sapping every bit of moisture instantly, and the forest seemed to waver like a mirage in the sun's glare. Trees blackened in an instant, crumbling to ash despite being soaked minutes before, and smoke arose from them, thick black smoke that threatened to block out the sun again. The flames did not die either. In some places they had licked trees farther back, not enough to destroy them completely, but enough to ignite them. And now the flames were spreading, dancing from tree to tree. It was almost hypnotic, and Trollian had forced himself to turn back around and watch where his horse was going. But soon he had reached the foothills and swung his mount back around, watching the horrible devastation. "Do something," Alleria yelled, appearing beside him again as he sat on his horse and squinted against the light and the heat. She pounded on his leg with her fists. "Do something." "There's nothing I can do," Trollian pointed out, his heart breaking at the grief throbbing in her voice. "I wish there was." "Then you do something," the elven rager demanded, turning to Khadgar as he rode up beside them. "Use your magic, put out the flames." But the old seeming mage shook his head sadly. "There's too much fire for me to combat it all," he explained softly, "and I've already drained myself for the day summoning that storm earlier." He said the last part bitterly, and Trollian felt for his friend. It wasn't Khadgar's fault that he'd put out the first wave of fires, only to have these far worse blazes appear now. "I need to get to Silvermoon," Alleria said, more to herself than to them. "My parents are there, and our elders. I need to help them." "And what will you do?" Trollian asked, his words coming out harsher than he'd intended, though At least it snapped her out of her grief long enough to look up at him. Do you have a way to combat these flames? He gestured at the forest, where the dragons were now diving and wheeling like bats at play, spreading flames with every pass. As far as the eye could see now, Kel'Thalas was burning. The smoke seemed a solid wall of gray above the elven homeland, and its shadow reached them on the foothills and cast darkness behind them across the mountains. Trollian was sure they could see the conflagration in Capital City. Alleria shook her head, and he saw tears streaming down her cheeks. But I have to do something, she all but wailed, her normally lovely voice hoarse with anger and pain. My home is dying. I know, and I understand. Reaching down, Trollian rested one hand on her shoulder, squeezing gently. But going in there now would only spell your death. Even if you could get to the river, it must be boiling from all that heat. You'd die and would not be able to help anyone. She looked up at him. My family, the lords, will they be all right? He could hear the desperation in her voice. She wanted, perhaps needed, to believe they survive. They're powerful magi, Khadgar pointed out. And while I've never seen it, I understand the Sunwell is a source of immense power. They'll shield the city from harm. Even the dragons won't be able to touch them. He sounded completely certain, though Trollian saw his friend quirk one eyebrow at him, as if to say, at least I hope so. Alleria nodded, though she was clearly still shaken. Thank you, she said quietly. You are right. My death now would accomplish nothing. Trollian suspected she was trying to convince herself of that. She glared at the dragons fluttering and soaring beyond. But theirs would. The entire hordes would, especially the orcs. Her green eyes narrowed, and Trollian saw something there he had not seen in her before. Hatred. They brought this destruction upon us, she spat. I will see them suffer for it. We all will. Trollian looked up as another elf strode toward them. He was dressed in full war gear, his armor beautiful and graceful, but clearly functional and covered in blood and gore. At his side hung a long sword, and deep green cloak fluttered behind him. He had removed his leaf-patterned helm, and dark brown eyes shone beneath glossy hair the color of corn silk, and his expression mirrored Alleria's own. Lord Thamar Theron, Alleria introduced him, one of our finest rangers. Then she turned and smiled briefly as a second elf approached, this one a tall woman with a similar cloak and features much like Alleria's, though her hair was a shade darker. And this is my sister, Sylvanas Windrunner, Ranger General and Commander of our forces. Sylvanas, Lord Theron, this is Sir Trollian of the Silver Hand, second in command of the Alliance forces, and Khadgar of Dalaran, Mage. Trollian nodded, and Theron returned the gesture, a show of respect among equals. Most of my warriors escaped the Inferno, Theron told them briskly. We cannot breach the flames, however, and so we are trapped without, while our families are trapped within. Now we know how the fire spread through the forest so quickly and from so many directions. His hand tightened on the hilt of his sword. But we cannot linger on such thoughts, he announced, his words directed at Alleria, and perhaps himself as well. We are here, and we must do what we can to succor our people as quickly as possible, and that means destroying the forces threatening them. Your commander, Anduin Lothar, sent word to us once before, asking for our participation in this alliance, Sylvanas stated, looking up at Trollian. My leaders chose not to respond beyond a token show of support. Her gaze flickered to Alleria, and something like a smile crossed her face. Though some of our rangers took it upon themselves to lend aid to your cause. Then she sobered again. But my elders realized their error when the trolls and orcs invaded our lands. For if Kel'Thalas is not safe from incursion, what is? They ordered me to assemble our warriors and march to meet you. and to render such aid as we could. She bowed. We would be proud to join your alliance, Sir Turalyon, and I hope that our deeds henceforth will compensate for the tardiness of our involvement. Turalyon nodded, wishing once again that Lothar was here. The champion would know how to handle this situation properly, but he was not, and so Turalyon was forced to muddle through as best he could. I thank you, and your people, he told Sylvanas finally. We welcome you and all your kin into our alliance. Together we will drive the Horde from this continent, from your lands and ours, that we may everward live in peace and cooperation once again. Anything else he had planned to say was interrupted by a squawk overhead, and the sudden fluttering of wings. Turalyon ducked, as did Khadgar, and Theron reached for his sword. But the descending creature was far smaller than a dragon, and covered in feathers and fur rather than scales. Sorry, lad, Gurdrun Windhammer said as he landed Skyrie just beyond them, causing the horses to shudder and stamp their feet in dismay. We tried, but those dragons are simply too big and too powerful for the handful of us to face. Give us time and we'll be finding a way to face them in the sky and beat them down, but right now they've got the upper hand. Turalyon nodded. Thank you for your efforts, he told the dwarf leader, and for your aid earlier. It saved many lives. He glanced around him. Khadgar, Alleria, Sylvanas, Lor Thamar, Theron, and Gurdrun Wildhammer. These were good people and good lieutenants. He suddenly did not feel so alone or so self-conscious. With them at his side, perhaps he could be a leader, or at least until Lothar returned. We need to get our people out of here, he told them after a moment. We will return and free Calathalos from the Horde, but right now we need to regroup and wait. I suspect the Horde is not going to stay here for long. They have some other goal in mind. But what, he wondered. They had taken the forest and driven the elves from their home. They had attacked Airy Peak and crushed Kaz Modan. Where would they strike next? He tried to think of it from the orcs' point of view. If he were them, and was handling their campaign, where would he go? What was the single biggest remaining threat? Then it hit him. The biggest threat was the heart of the Alliance itself, the place where it had all started. He glanced at Khadgar, who nodded, clearly thinking the same thing. Capital City. It made sense. From Silvermoon, which stood at the northern tip of Calathalos, the orcs could march over the mountains and directly into Lordaeron, emerging not far from Lordamere Lake and Capital City itself. The city had few defenders left, King Tyrannus having sent most of his men with the Alliance. Fortunately, marching over the mountains would mean making their way across Alsharok first, and while Perinold had not been the most stalwart member of the Alliance, he would certainly rally his forces against an invasion of his own lands. But the orcs could overwhelm Alsharok through sheer numbers, and then swarm down out of the mountains to strike the city. From Lordaeron, they could spread down across the rest of the continent, Alleria pointed out, and if they left a force here, they would have 2 points of origin. They could blanket the land with orcs in weeks. Turalyon nodded. Now we know what they are planning, he said. Sure, they were right. Which means we need to find a way to stop them. He glanced at the raging fires beyond. But not here. Get the men back into the hills proper, and we will meet and discuss this further. Then he wheeled his horse around and cantered away from the forest, trusting his lieutenants to see his orders carried out, and unwilling to look any more at the majestic wood burning behind him.